Hi everyone, Ben Raysmith here, Senior Sports and Exercise Physio with Athletics Australia, based up at the AIS for the last 10 years or so. Taking an opportunity today to introduce a couple of topics, an introductory topic around health literacy for coaches and athletes, and then how to apply that in a monitoring sense, a bit of an introduction with some descriptions of then how things might be done at the high performance level. So moving right ahead, there are two foundations in the area of knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing. Essentially, how can we better transfer our information that we know in science and medicine and between coaches that helps us better have an effect on an athlete or a developing career. There are two primary aspects to this that influence success and failure. One of them is the capacity of the athlete, and that covers all performance levels. That's their pathway through the Talent ID program, coaching, conditioning, their internal makeup of habits, resilience, and the support network around them. So everything to do with capacity that influences performance success or failure. And another cornerstone of that is being available to train for the program that a coach might plan for an athlete. Reasonably fundamental that if you're sitting on the couch injured or sick, you have no capacity to do what you need to do to go and perform. So everything that we talk about is geared towards one of these two things, either minimizing risk or maximizing capacity, or ideally combining the two. Ultimately, performance outcome is all that matters. So this leads into the concept of our belief systems. And unless there's clear evidence to the contrary, no one can tell you what your belief system should be. We all bring our own biases to the table from our education, our life experiences, our high performance sport experiences. They are what they are, and there is rarely evidence that will be counter to what someone's belief systems are when they're experience based. However, there are times where there is strong evidence that we need to use to inform our decision making. But as a coach in the performance space, where is it that you seek your information? It's acknowledging that we have our belief systems in place, but how do you gather further information in the area that you're interested in? There's some research around how coaches do this. They might talk to crazy scientists or sports scientists along the way. Many of them might do their own research and have some experience with searching literature databases, have access to textbooks, etc. Many coaches have gone through formal training programs. Others do that in a formal sense, whether it's through courses, lectures, and so forth, or other experiences as teachers or sports scientists themselves. But the most common way that coaches seek information from research that's looked into this is from each other. Coaches will tend to ask their mates, athletes will tend to ask their mates as well, and many practitioners will do the same. The question that comes from that then is putting that information into your belief system, and where you seek your information is how equipped are you with a knowledge base to critique that information. Seeking information isn't a wrong thing to do. Everyone Googles things, everyone looks things up, but it's important to have some sounding board that you might go and bounce that around on. Is this correct? Should I be implementing this? How does it fit into what I'm doing as a coach or an athlete? So this then moves into the topic of what we term high performance health literacy. The body, health, wellness factors that influence performance success and failure. And literacy simply means knowing about them. Are you aware of them? And simple awareness influences implementing things into your planning. What's going on in the back of your brain while you're putting a planning program together or a performance program together? The topics I just want to touch on today then is base knowledge, information around concepts of clusters and profiles, and the idea of a risk bucket that some of you may have already come across, and the ideas of stimulus and lag time. So having a conceptual base knowledge of these topics We hope then just sits in the back of the brain while coaches enter their own artistic expertise and scientific expertise into their training program planning. So first up, on to clusters. What is a cluster? A cluster is essentially a collection of things. It's how a system works. Our bodies are biological systems. There are so many cascading influences of things. The presence of something influences something else and how it happens. Rarely are there single things that have a major effect. It's like aeroplane crashes. If you ever watch Air Crash Investigators, it's rarely one catastrophic event that happens. It's a progression of a bunch of things in the presence of each other that lead to the cascading failure ultimately. So that's a system, and so clusters is the concept of a system. We'll tend to blame single factors when things go wrong, and that's a little bit of a human trait, and we've all experienced being surrounded by people that have some pretty strong opinions of, well, this is why that happened. And people bring their expertise to that. It's not necessarily incorrect or wrong. It's just unlikely that there'll be a single factor that was really the thing that caused the problem. So message number one is think in terms of a system, that there is likely to be multiple factors. A point is that we will probably never know all the factors that are present that influence an outcome, be that a positive outcome or a negative outcome. So how do we critique, how do we rationalise what might have been the influencing things with that outcome? Plenty of cogs in the wheel, and that's just a nice example, I think, of how there are many factors that influence each other along the way. Be those biomechanical, be those the structure of training in the week or in a day where you place things on a Monday, Tuesday through to Sunday. Life stresses are a significant input, what's going on in someone's life, and then we have all the other physiological factors such as nutrition, sleep and recovery and so forth. So there are many factors that we know a lot about that influence the cogs in this wheel. So an example of how we might look at those things, when we talk about PBs or performance success or breaking a record, whatever that might be, or achieving a performance goal, we'll often talk about many things. Yeah, there was a heap of stuff that came together. I got the taper right, felt really relaxed on the day. I don't know what it was. I felt confident. I knew I was going to do well. You could look at a history of training, go, look, I had no interrupted sessions over the last 3 months. It was the best training block I've ever had. I'm in good physical shape. I was doing some good measures in the gym, and some of my time trials were indicating I was going to go well. This is what a system is, and this is the concept of clusters. All of those things put together are a reason why you PB'd or had a performance success. It won't just be one thing. It's not just because you got the taper right, and it's not just because you're in good physical shape if the mind isn't there, for example. This is the concept we talk about in the presence of. It's a term I use a fair bit through the presentation and generally when talking to coaches. What was present when you had your performance success, and we might see common trends of the things that are present with some athletes. Also knowing that these things are dynamic. It's a fluid world of the presence of different things in an athlete's life, and those will shift from time to time depending on what's happening in their life, the training phase that you're in. So again, even though we might identify what some of the key factors are, they'll be present in different magnitudes at different phases of training. Now, when we talk about negative events, and there'll be injuries, illnesses, failed goals, whatever it might be, a negative event, our human nature is that we will tend to blame single factors. And that's where we'll have people come to us and say, look, they have this injury all the time because their pelvis needs checking. They need a full biomechanical assessment. This is where our world used to go, looking for the mechanical minutiae in things. We then progressed on a little bit and we'd talk about, it's because I shouldn't have travelled that day. I should have given myself one more day of recovery after travel. I should have slept on a different bed. I think that's what made me feel awful today. We'll tend to launch at single factors when we have a negative event. What we need to do in a performance success sense and a performance failure or injury illness sense is bring the concept of clusters across, and simply be aware that there are plenty of factors that will have influenced the success and the failures. How do we get a better feel of those, knowing that we will never actually know all of them, or how that system truly interacts? Those factors that influence negative outcomes, we tend to blame mechanistic ones in the first instance, but other things to consider in a strong way are the structure of training through the week, body and life systems, what's going on in this athlete's life, what are their stress levels, hormone levels, happiness levels. Also having an awareness of what type of injury the athlete is experiencing, in that the majority of injuries in our sport come on gradually, and they will have a different cluster of things that influence a gradual onset injury versus an acute injury. So putting the cluster together, we've got the concept of a risk profile bucket. And there are plenty of injuries within the Australian national sports system that have come up with or demonstrated a reasonably consistent pattern of the 80-20 rule. 80% of a collection of things that we'll go through in a second influence whether someone has a negative outcome or becomes injured, or influences success likely as well. Here's the risk bucket, and the idea is when the risk bucket fills up to the top, that's when injury or illness occurs. Now you could put this in the light of a positive sense as well. If I will have a greater likelihood of achieving performance success if I fill my bucket with these certain things. But we're going to use the context here in terms of getting injured or sick, as I'm a physiotherapist, and that's where our lives generally live in the first instance. So the 80%, coloured blue, is made up of body and life systems, and there are 4 factors that dominate this as topics. The first one is energy availability. Do you have enough fuel in your system for your local tissue, be that bone, tendon, muscle? Do you have enough fuel in the system for your physiology in terms of energy system, energy system access, energy system performance? So in the bucket scenario, there may be positives or negatives with the energy system. When are you fueling? Are you fueling effectively? Are you putting the right fuel in? Are you doing it at the right time during the day post-training? You may be balanced in your energy intake and output, yet you may be depleted. Think of the scenario of a university student that might be balanced, money in and money out, but they're certainly not living in a mansion with $1 million in the bank. So they're balanced but depleted is an interesting concept to keep in the back of the mind. So for some athletes in their system, this might start to fill up a part of their bucket and push them towards that risk line. Energy availability across a significant number of injuries across all sports is the primary factor. Second factor, interestingly, is mental health. So that's life stresses around university exams, common ones for our developing kids. But it's also a mindset. How self-critical is an athlete? How do they behave or react when they have poor training form? If they're not meeting goals in training, or can't get a particular technique right and start to become a little bit self-critical. Do they have habits along those lines? Do they have other things in their life occur in terms of a pet passing away or the like? So mental health, that can be a short-term immediate scenario, or it can be a long-term health condition in terms of big D depression, short-term or long-term. That's the second biggest influence in terms of negative outcomes, injury and illnesses across the majority of sports in Australia. So let's just put that into our bucket as another factor in the presence of. Next is training load structure. So this is where a lot of time is spent in planning, and that will include your week-to-week structure, your daily structure of where you place things in the week. You can't do block starts, for example, as a sprinter, 5 days in a row, 3 weeks in a row. Something might happen. So we're looking at micro and macro planning in terms of training structure, phases of training, progressions of those into competition phase, what taper looks like. And then you can work down to the micro nature of what's the content of the training sessions. Also in this topic are things like rate of change, which is probably the biggest factor in terms of it doesn't matter what you're doing. If there is a high rate of change of that, in terms of I suddenly added spikes, doing a lot of sessions in spikes, then obviously risk will increase of a soft tissue type injury. Or if I go from running 20 kilometres a week after Christmas break for 3 weeks into 60, 70 to 100 kilometres a week, how long am I taking to build that up? Too rapid a change will obviously be a large factor that contributes to a bone onset, gradual onset type of injury. So training load structure number 3. Then how the body is refreshing and recovering from those sessions that have been planned is the 4th biggest factor that influences injury risk. So is an athlete recovering? Are they going through a stressful period in their life? It links in closely with topic number 2. Exam time stress, shortened sleep cycles, poor sleep quality, sleep health as a topic. So even though we've filled up our bucket with a bunch of these hypotheticals, we still actually haven't reached the red line of being injured. It's in the presence of these really significant body and life systems that are other mechanistic factors that we put so much effort in our research towards and discussions, it's when these may become highly relevant. So that quirky technique that they have, the quirky anatomical feature that might make them a bit different, in the presence of the body and life systems, these mechanistic factors do and can become quite important. But having them on their own won't necessarily mean that you are going to get injured. You can look there, if you minimize the body life system factors, then you can minimize the influence of the mechanistic factors by not reaching the red line. So that's the concept of the risk bucket. It'll either be injury, illness, or poor performance. If you stay below the red line, conceptually, that's when you're more likely to have your performance success. Now, each of these profiles will be quite unique to each different athlete. So this is the idea of understanding the profile of an athlete. When I assess an athlete for the first time, a lot of it's about getting to know them, getting to know personality, getting to know on a bell curve where their body sits. An example of a few things. Are you loosey-goosey or are you stiff? Do you have high tone or are you very supple? And you can have combinations of these things in different ways. Do you have a lot of power and ping, or are you an endurance type athlete? And you can have mix and match of those. You can have a sprinter that's got a lot of power ping. You can also have an endurance athlete that's got a lot of power and ping. So coming up with your different bell curves can be unique to each athlete. Are you an OCD type character, obsessive compulsive, list writing athlete, loves ticking lists, got to tick it off? Or are you fairly laid back, Jamaican, kick back in character, like, hey coach, just tell me what I need to do today and I'll do it. Don't really worry about the detail. There is no right and wrong here. Everyone is different. Different is normal. But the key to this is getting an insight to and understanding what is your athlete's profile. And we can work with any mix of these. It's simply knowing where do you sit on these bell curves. And that's why we don't work to recipes when we talk about preparation training, performance preparation, gym structure, recovery from injury, and the information that we deliver to someone about their injury. All of that is influenced by their unique profile, how they like to absorb information, how their body responds to different training factors. There is no recipe to go and win a medal or do training with someone. You need to tailor it and to the individual. So that's the literacy of understanding an athlete's profile and knowing that we'll have athletes with very different mixes of all of these things. I've just put 4 up there as an example. Again, in our system mentality, there are plenty more, and we probably never know what they all are, but we work out, well, what are the big rock ones that you like to know about with an athlete. This will influence something, for example, whether I tell an athlete to be stretching or not. Sometimes you will and sometimes you won't. There is no single right answer to how much stretching someone should do. It will be influenced by what body type they are and also what their belief systems are around doing those activities. So our next topic about putting this together towards becoming injured, or again, you can think of this in a performance success sense as well. Stimulus and lag time. As I mentioned, the majority of our injuries in athletics are considered gradual onset, up to 3/4 of them in fact. Rarely do we get that sudden sprained ankle. It's not that common. Rarely do we get that pinged hamstring. When we look at all of our injuries in our sport, nearly 3/4 of them will be considered, yeah, this crept up on me. I just became a bit symptomatic and sore. So how does that look in a medical, physical health sense? Here's our bucket, our factors that are unique to that injury, to that athlete. When the bucket's tipped up to the red line, we'll consider that to be a stimulus point. What will tend to happen is that an athlete won't necessarily notice that something has happened in a particular training session or a particular training week. They will rarely say, hey, something's just happened to me. They might, great, but it doesn't always happen. It's not that common. When you've had a stimulus that's a risk bucket type stimulus, the presence of all their risk factors that's just tipped them over the edge a little bit, we'll often then see a lag time. And this lag time will vary depending on the tissue type. If it's bone, if it's harder tissue, the lag time will be a bit longer. If it's a soft tissue type stimulus problem, we'll often see it in a shorter time period, in a matter of 1 week or days. So look at this as the body has been stung or the system has been stung, but you can't quite feel it yet. You may have an inkling of something, but you tend to go, I'll be right, I'll push through, I'll just warm up a bit more. I think I need to just do a bit more stretching. So that's the lag time. And then the niggle starts, and the athlete will present to somebody or talk a bit more to the coach, hey, that thing I've had, it's not quite going away, it's getting a bit worse. That's when they might walk into the clinic and talk to us. And we will dig about what did you do in the last month, let's say, leading up to this, because something must have changed. We try to create the contents of the risk profile bucket that's been the stimulus point. So that's where a lot of our conversation goes, in that niggle starts week. And it's by then it's almost too late that the injury's happened. That's the concept of stimulus and lag time. So how you put that together is the idea of, in your planning, be very mindful in the background of the cluster effect, the system effect, how multiple things in the presence of will come together. And if there is a large change in any of those things, that can constitute a filling of the bucket and a stimulus. And once that's occurred, if you can see or have an inkling of that happening with your athlete, that the problem they have, whether it's a tendon problem, a bone problem, a muscle problem, may not show up for 2 to 3 weeks. And then we're looking at backtracking to figure out, well, why did this happen? So that's the topic of performance health literacy. Putting it together in a summary, it's knowing about things so that you can factor those in when you're planning. It's clusters and profiles, the idea of stimulus, then lag time, and identifying the unique features for your athlete in the risk profile bucket in the presence of. So what we'll move on to now in part 2 is, how do you bring these things together in a practical monitoring sense with your athletes? We're talking then about the real life habits and behaviors of an athlete. Are they fueling well? How do they switch on and off mentally from training in the mental health space? Do they have adequate coping skills and planning skills, both for the coach and the athlete? Are we addressing those if we see an athlete being overly self-critical? And are we keeping an eye on how their recovery and sleep is going? Habits and behaviors. For the athlete to become literate and the coach to become literate, it's knowing, well, what sort of body type are you? Should I stretch? Is that the most effective thing for me? Or should I more effectively use trigger balls or rollers for how my body is? What should my strength profile be at this particular training age, regardless of chronological age? So understanding some of the unique features of your own body. And the third topic in becoming literate from an athlete's standpoint in particular is ownership and empowerment. So an athlete's capacity to sense their own body and be able to report it as skills that are so worth developing in the early stages of their career. Having an athlete be able to identify, have you lost range in your shoulder being a javelin thrower? How do you test that? And do you get a feel of what's normal for you? What's a normal range of stiffness, so that you can pick up going, hey, this feels really different this week and I'm not sure why. I wonder if I've had a stimulus moment and there's gradual onset things are happening. Maybe I should go and talk to someone or have it looked at. That's empowerment, and that's the athlete being proactive rather than waiting until catastrophe happens. So 3 things to look at. Have I lost range? Some really simple tests. Is this soreness or symptom different from what I normally experience? And is it changing after training or through training? Is it different this week from how it was last week? Identifying those things, empowering the athlete to look for them themselves, own it themselves, and then be proactive in their conversations about it. So let's put that into monitoring. What are practical things that you can do in the monitoring space? Monitoring is basically to observe and check progress over a period of time. Looking for positive things, looking for negative things, putting it all together. Let's talk about it in the sense of the cluster. To gain insight into an athlete's profile in the presence of. Monitoring is to start looking for what are the big circles, what are the big rocks, what are the things that are commonly present in my athlete or me as an athlete when I do well and when I don't do well. When success occurs or when things go wrong. There are 3 categories that I like to look for in a basic monitoring program that anyone can set up, and we'll give you some ideas of how you might be able to start doing this and implement it at a very introductory stage, and then just a couple of examples of the high performance space to give it some context. So the 3 categories, if you are wanting to start introducing some sort of monitoring, these are the 3 things that I go looking for. It's worth collecting status of an athlete over time. Are you training or are you not training? And just tracking that. Monitoring I'll touch on a little bit more detail, and then the idea of soreness. So what are the factors that we look for in each of those? Quite simply, in a training status, it's just logging. Did the athlete do full training? Are they logging sorenesses this week? Or they're in a modified or no training sense. A simple traffic light system works well. Regarding soreness, it's just having the athlete log body parts and rating that out of 10. Yeah, today I felt it in my ankle. It's a 3 out of 10. Done. So having habits for the athlete logging this in their training diaries after each training session. You as a coach may or may not want that information to keep in a spreadsheet as well, but at least it's logged somewhere so that a lot of conversation time isn't wasted once the athlete needs to go and see someone about a problem of, well, how did this behave in the last month? The monitoring factors we look at then are broken down into 3 parts. The response and readiness to train, training parameters, which are basic training diary features, and then performance parameters, the things that give you a real indication of how the athlete's going. So let's just unpack those in a little bit more detail. So of our 3 categories, how do we do these? How might you go about them? It's quite simple, just over a log of a calendar over 12 months, just using 6 months here as an example, to put a traffic light system. I do this in an Excel spreadsheet, and I just color code. In the high performance sense, we do this daily, so each athlete in our system has a daily status. But in the early days, I used to do this weekly. Just on a weekend, on a Sunday, I used to think through the list that we're looking after and go, did they have any modifications this week? In which case, I would put them as red. Were they logging a soreness? I just want to flag that they've raised something. They're not yet modified. We haven't had to change anything, but they're talking about this calf tightness that's just been there this week. So I'll flag that as orange, and green is full training. What we do see from this then is patterns start to evolve season after season. We've got some athletes that develop sorenesses in the same month each year, and that just becomes a good planning conversation or a point of awareness for the coach to think through, right, well, how am I building things through that period if it's happening year after year. You can see squad trends with this or trends within individuals. Overlaid on that, then most of you in your planning will just have the seasons logged there, so an international season or a domestic season, and the yellows, etc., might depict where competition periods are, general prep, specific prep 1, specific prep 2. Your own systems, your own color codes, of course they all merge into each other, but we can get just a feel of then where sorenesses develop and when injuries might occur. And we've got a track record of it to have a conversation about it if need be, if the athlete ever develops some injuries. But you can then also see patterns of when you're building athletes in their training of when they develop those sorenesses. Having a body chart that you just fill in and record over time, so a single body chart for each athlete, and you can, for example, here get a sense that this athlete tends to develop right-sided problems. That's interesting, and we'll see that over 3 years, let's say, going, why are all your problems on the right side? That's quite useful information to us when we might be doing a health screening on the athlete to discuss and then go looking down a few rabbit holes at certain things. So really simple stuff around monitoring training status and then soreness. And once a week is when we might analyse those. That's the action part of this, recording that each week aligned with training phases and seasons. It's important to know the why. There's some basic logic around looking for patterns there, but there's also getting a feel of how this influences outcomes and when these things happen and whether that matters through a season. So we've done some research over the past 10 years or so and discovered that if athletes are available to you, the coach, greater than 80% of the time to complete the sessions that you've asked them to do, they will be 7 times more likely to achieve their performance goal. So being available matters, and if you can jump on things early, understand clusters, early signs of things in the presence of, keep the athlete available so that we don't end up with reds where possible, then you're automatically 7 times more likely to achieve your performance goal, whatever that might be that season. Here's what that looks like in a sense. There's been formal research that we've done on this. Here are 9 of our major championship seasons. These are our senior athletics group. We have our data on Doha, just haven't been able to enter it yet onto these charts. But let's look at 2 groups here, those that have achieved their goals and those that haven't achieved their goals in each of these major competitions. Over on the left-hand side is what percent of weeks were modified in the 6-month lead up. So we're talking about a 6-month prep period. How much modification time can you afford to have before it starts affecting achieving your goal? And here are the colours relating to each of the major championships, all the way up to one of the green dots there at 100% modified, leading up to London 2012. No wonder that athlete didn't achieve their performance goal. There'll be many reasons why athletes sit at different levels of modification. And some of them are not modified at all and didn't achieve their goal, and that will obviously be for other reasons and worth discussing with other people in the program. But does this group look different that achieve their goals? And the answer is yes, they do. They are far less modified, and when we run the statistics on this, it comes out that there's a cut-off score. And that cut-off score sits at around 20%. It's again a nice fit of that 80-20 rule. If you're modified for less than 80% of the time, you are far more likely to achieve your performance goal, 7 times in fact. So you're available 80% of the time. Out of those 9 seasons that we've looked at, 267 athlete occurrences in those seasons, on only 12 occasions have we had athletes achieve their goal when they've been modified more than 20% of weeks in that 6-month lead up period. It can be done. Absolutely it can be done. Those athletes were very well managed. But the easiest thing to try to do is to stay within this group, and that's when you know you will have a greater chance of performance success. Capturing things early, understanding lag time. Don't wait until something's catastrophic before you do something about it. Keep them training where possible. When getting injured matters in that 6-month period. So again, we've got the 2 groups here, the failed goal group and the succeeded goal group. Across the bottom in each of those categories, we can see 26 weeks up to comp week. So that's the 6-month period there. We've got 26 weeks. And on the left-hand scale and how high the bars are just a count of how many injury or illness events happened. So you can see there's a lot more injury illness events in the failed goal, interestingly, from the succeeding goal. But what we discovered here is in the group that failed, that was when 50% of illnesses occurred. So getting sick matters, and getting sick close to events matters. Opens the door to conversation. Well, why might that be the case? Are they becoming stressed? There might be a sense of, I'm not performing as well as I want to in training, and it starts to weigh on them heavily. Not sleeping as well. Nutrition might become a bit poor. Other things in their life, they're chasing something. So stress levels. So be mindful of stress, mental state, headspace, recovery strategies, nutrition strategies to offset illness in those last couple of months before a competition. The interesting part here is that the majority of new injuries, 30% of them, the majority of them out of all the new injuries occurred in the first preparation month of this 6-month block for both the performance and the success group. That's when most new injuries actually occurred. So what that suggests is when we come out of that transition of seasons from international or major competition season into our domestic summer, we might have a little bit of a break and then we prep again for domestic season. The first few weeks coming back into that prep phase, we're still 6 months out from our major competition or our major goal point, but that's when most injuries will occur. And once you get one injury, you're likely to get niggles and more niggles and more niggles that cascade on from that initial injury. So that first month, those first few weeks of coming back into training or starting to build into the new program are crucial. It's when most new injuries occur. And that's 6 months out. So let's put that together and just look at the sort of things to monitor. We've already covered the things like our full soreness modified training status and sauna stuff. So let's have a bit more of a look then at the details of monitoring. And these are the things that an athlete could be, often are, just recording themselves, written in their own diaries. As a coach, is it worth you collecting any of this information in spreadsheets? The idea here is that you start to collect your own information around the athlete, information that observes the patterns, the trends, and the combinations of what's high and what's low in the presence of, in the months preceding success and failure, for when we go back and look and analyse these things. Decide what to collect and then have some way to look back on it, looking at that lag time preceding. What was high, what was low? And we start to see patterns of, gee, this athlete does well every time this thing is present, and it's present in a high way, and this thing over here is backed right off. And it'll be across training structure, it'll be across macro and micro cycles and phase progressions. There just is no formula, algorithm, calculation to do that will tell us an answer on, are you going to get injured or will you perform a PB, this event. There is simply no single measure that will tell us that, or even a collection of measures. It is so much around observing the patterns, getting to know the athlete, their trends, their habits, and the combination of things that are present in this system, in this cluster. And that's got positives and negatives. The negative of that is, well, there's no easy answer to this. There's a bit of work in trying to understand the patterns and trends of the athletes. But the positive of that is that there's no right and wrong. You figure out how to do this for your athlete. Just break things down into these categories, collect some information on it, decide how much information you want to collect, and then a way to analyse it and look through it. So what are some of those things that we look for at an introductory level, and then a high performance example as well? So let's keep this as simple as possible. And we're talking about an Excel spreadsheet here, or a handwritten paper if you like. What could you do in the response and readiness to training sense? It very much sits in the, hey athlete, how are you going today? And the coach's eye in individual sports is equally as sensitive to changes and whether an athlete's going well or not as they do in team sports with all the wellness questionnaires. There's advantage to the amount of contact that you will have with your athletes in an individual sport, and you can very much trust a coach's eye in picking up things that a wellness questionnaire in a team sport setting is trying to do. The evidence is almost equivalent on those. So you could, if you want to track that, put the question formally to the athlete at each training session. All things considered, how ready are you to train today? And you might put your own considered things. Think mental approach, physical approach, technical proficiency approach. How are you feeling today when you think of those things? And let's just do a 5-point scale. 3 being average, up to 5 above, and 1 below. And you could just record that in each training session, each week as you go, and look back and just see if there's a trend next time the athlete does well or next time the athlete does injured. And this may or may not be a big topic for that athlete. What do we do in a high performance sense here? We do have formalised questionnaires that have been validated on a world scale here. Australia is a part of some of these projects in developing these. There's one called the Short Recovery Stress Scale. It's 4 questions on stress and 4 questions on recovery that have been analysed and seen to be valid in picking up and sensitive to changes in the athlete. This is available publicly as well if someone wants to go that far, and rather than the 5-point scale at the introductory level, you could start these habits with your athletes if you want to go so far as that. This exists in an electronic system for us. It does not need to be done daily, thankfully. This can be planned around major training sessions 2 to 3 times a week, or it might be once a week under some circumstances. Training parameters. These are the training features, things that you've done in training. Now, at a really simple level, these are 3 things: duration, volume, and intensity. Now, duration is simply I showed up to training at this time and I left at this time. I was mentally switched on and applied to training during this time frame. Volumes is then event specific. And it's thinking of not counting everything that you ever do necessarily. You need to write that in your training plan. But in terms of our factors we look for that influence performance success or failure, we just want to collect a few things that really influence impact on the body. So that might be number of jumps, number of throws, number of hurdles run over today. Did you run over 5 hurdles this week, or 50 hurdles this week, or 200 hurdles this week? That matters in terms of whether their body's getting sore. So a simple count of volume. And intensity is just that rating out of 10, an RPE for an athlete to go, well, duration, I was here for this long. I feel that was a 7 out of 10 in terms of total exertion. It's not an effort level. Effort is always 100%, hopefully, but this is a how did it impact your body and your system. It impacted me a 7 out of 10. I put in 100% effort, but it impacted me 7 out of 10. They're the 3 features. Keep it simple, and you can start to develop your own graphs and charts, let's say, on those things if you like, or simply look at them in numbers. How does that look different in the high performance space? It is simply that we do a more advanced representation of this in our reporting, and the experiences of people in a high performance system look for a lot of detail and analysis in these numbers. But it's fundamentally based around those 3 same parameters. What are performance parameters then? We don't have the luxury in athletics necessarily of weekly competitions like in the team sports to judge how an athlete's going. So performance parameters are the indicators that you as a coach or the athlete feel this is the thing that connects with me, that gives me a real sense of whether I'm going well or not. Now that might be something like the speed of a rope climb test that you do in the gym each month. There might be a time trial, might be some of your gym strength testing, or it might be a VO2 max test, or anything like that. You know, time trial is simple for the distance guys. Might be a standing long jump for some of the jumpers, just to get a sense of, well, how pingy are you this week? So what are your little performance indicators that really give you a sense of you're going well or things aren't going well? And once you collect those things over time, just a handful of them, you can connect them with the training parameters, connect them with the response to training, connect them with the soreness, things that you're measuring as well, and you can start to observe the cluster of patterns that start to evolve. And again, in the high performance sense, there's just a lot of conversation that goes towards trying to work out what are the performance parameters unique to this squad, unique to that coaching group, unique to this athlete, that really give us a feel of whether they're going well or not. Prediction is exceptionally difficult, and to the point where we don't even really talk about predicting outcomes of injuries or illness. We're simply looking at likelihoods here. You've got all these features present. Usually when they're present, you tend to do well. So it's giving them an environment to do well, but then equally so identifying the factors that are there when they may become injured or sick as well. So in summary, pulling all that together, we looked at literacy and we looked at monitoring. So trying to understand the features of an athlete. Understanding there's a cluster of things. Each athlete has their own profile, and in the presence of, the bucket might become full. But rarely does one factor alone cause a catastrophic event. Knowing that there's often stimulus point in athletics, and that 3/4 of our injuries are gradual onset. So something happens in training or features of training or in life that then lead to the problem really popping up 3 weeks later. So it's having an awareness and empowerment of the athlete to be sensitive to picking up some of those changes and having the conversation early so that modification doesn't need to be significant. Because we become too modified in our training plan, then we're at less chance of achieving our performance goal. Then how does that look in a monitoring sense? We've got our 3 big categories: status, monitoring, and then soreness. Some things to collect on those topics, and then some of the detail of what to collect in the monitoring sense. So hopefully that's been of benefit to you, connecting literacy and awareness of where you get your information, how do you critique it, how do you apply it to an individual athlete, and then a practical sense of how to apply that in a monitoring space. We'll provide some resources along with this as well, just some pages that you can refer back to, and some access to some links out of the AS High Performance System and AA High Performance System as well. Thanks very much for your time. Cheers.